How did artillery impact the stoutest achievement of Australian soldiers in France during the First World War? We look at the role of artillery in the First Battle of Bullecourt.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 73 of the Principles of War podcast. Today we're heading to the cold and muddy trenches of the Western Front in April 1917 as we continue our series commemorating 150 years of permanent Australian artillery. In this series, we're only going to look at two battles from the First World War because many of these battles have been covered eminently well in the Royal Australian Artillery Historical Company's Firepower Seminar series, and I'll include a link in the show notes. There's lots of really interesting seminars that have been conducted there. Before we get into it, a quick mention of the references that I've used in researching this battle. First off, David Coombs, he's written two books. He's written the Battles of Bullecourt for the Army History Unit. I wouldn't say that it's a short book. It's the shortest book. It's the most accessible one of the Bullecourt books. It gives an excellent overview of it. He's also written The Greater Sum of Sorrow, a more in-depth look at it. Jonathan Walker wrote The Blood Tub. This is a really interesting book as well. Looks at it from a slightly different perspective, more of a British-orientated perspective, but also some very interesting lessons from that. Of course, there's Bean's Official History. Nice, very easily accessible. It's available to download from the Australian War Memorial. It gives a different perspective again. It brings out some of the more lower level details which I think are really quite interesting and relevant to the lessons that we're trying to draw out from the Battle of Bullecourt. Lastly, Do Unto Others by Alan Smith. This is a really interesting book that looks at an arcane art, that of counter-battery fire. Counter-battery fire has got a big story to play in the Battle of Bullecourt, predominantly by its absence and the fact that it hasn't been developed at this point. The Australian Army, in fact British artillery in general, was a fair way behind the Germans in 1917. Today we're going to be looking at the First Battle of Bullecourt. Charles Bean, the author of the Official History, wrote that Australian troops braved the odds in numerous battles, but that Bullecourt was the most brilliant of these achievements, impressing both enemy and friends alike. It was in some ways the stoutest achievement of the Australian soldier in France, carried through against the stubbornest enemy that had ever faced him there. Following the withdrawal from the Gallipoli campaign, the 1st ANZAC Corps started deploying to the Western Front in March 1916. All 5 of its divisions were on the Western Front by November 1916, the last being Monash's 3rd Division. They quickly realised that they faced a more competent enemy, and 1st ANZAC was now just one of 18 corps made up of 44 infantry and 5 cavalry divisions across 5 British armies. Added to this, there were 5 French armies. The winter of 1916-1917 was the worst in 40 years. Each Australian division suffered 200 frostbite and trenchfoot cases a week. Birdwood, the corps commander, reminded junior officers to look after the men's feet, and cases went down. However, troops still froze to death in the trenches. 65,000 sheepskin jackets were hurriedly dispatched from Australia. The time in the trenches was reduced to just 6 days for each battalion, which meant that the most that a single man would do was no more than 48 hours continuous trench duty in every 12 days. Conditions were so bad that some Australian soldiers malingered, several shot themselves, and 1 or 2 deserted to the enemy, something that was unheard of in the AIF. At the strategic level, the 1st of February saw the commencement of unrestricted U-boat warfare following an unsuccessful peace offer from the Germans. Their intent was to starve Britain out of the war. Just prior to this, in December 1916, the French had ended the disastrous Battle of Verdun. They had replaced General Joffre with the dashing General Robert Nivelle. Lloyd George, who was then the British Prime Minister, suggested placing the British under French command. Haig was extremely distressed at this thought. He threatened to King George V to resign, so the PM backed down. Nivelle came up with a plan to achieve a broad breakthrough with massive artillery support. Nivelle planned for his main effort to be in the Chemin de Dama, with the British attacking in the Arras area and a further French attack in the River Oise as a diversion. This was to be a set-piece offensive with limited objectives and massed artillery. A new war minister came into the French cabinet, Paul Paradis, and he clashed with Nivelle about his plan. Nivelle threatened to resign. He stated his only fears was if the enemy would evacuate. The more Germans there are, the greater the victory will be. Paradis agreed to the plan, but only on the condition that Nivelle would resign if no breakthrough occurred at Chemin de Dama. Haig agreed with the offensive and planned to commit the British 1st, 3rd and 5th Armies to the Arras offensive. However, planning for the offensive was preempted by an unexpected German withdrawal. On the 23rd of February 1917, German forces commenced withdrawing troops from the front line. They commenced Operation Alberich from the 16th to the 20th of March. This was a general withdrawal to the Siegfried Line, or as the Allies referred to it, the Hindenburg Line. Rather than withdrawing because of enemy pressure, they were withdrawing to carefully prepared defensive positions on terrain of their choosing, which was heavily fortified. The withdrawal saw as much as 45 miles being surrendered by the Germans. The decrease in frontage, however, decreased manning in the trenches by the equivalent of 13 divisions. This was the start of the new flexible or elastic defensive doctrine. 2 or 3 deep trenches, defensive zones protected by up to 9 belts of barbed wire in many places. The barbed wire, many feet thick. Strong points, expertly sighted, contained machine guns which provided overlapping arcs of fire. In the Australian sector, Pompey Elliott's 15th Brigade and Gellibrand's 6th Brigade conducted an advance in 2 columns following up the withdrawing Germans, and they were flanked and screened by the 13th Light Horse in their traditional role, but a role that they were unaccustomed to performing. For the upcoming attack, Haig was planning a main effort with Allenby's 3rd Army in the Arras area. Now remember, this is a diversionary attack with the intent of drawing German reinforcements away from the French assault. Allenby's 3rd Army would be supported by 1st Army on its left flank or to the north. This was going to be Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng's Canadian Corps attacking at Vimy Ridge. Now, Vimy Ridge was an incredibly successful battle, and we're going to cover this in another podcast. To the south, Allenby would be supported by the British 5th Army under Lieutenant General Gough. This was to be the attack at Bullecourt. Allenby's Arras attack would see a creeping barrage with 1 British heavy gun for every 20 yards of front. This is compared to 55 yards at the Somme. There was also better allocation of ammunition, there would be less studs, and the new 106 instantaneous fuse would be in use. This is a really interesting piece of technical innovation. The British had started the war predominantly using shrapnel fuses. These were a timed fuse that would explode, pushing shrapnel out over the battlefield, catching troops in the open. The problem was that it was no good in clearing barbed wire being an invention of the First World War for trench warfare. To solve this problem, the British adapted a French mechanism to create a fuse that would explode reliably at the slightest touch at the nose of the shell. This touch could be as slight as the shell hitting a strand of barbed wire. The instantaneous explosion made it much better at clearing barbed wire. There would be a 5-day artillery bombardment in preparation for the attack, and there would be 18 divisions attacking, supported by 2,818 artillery pieces, which is 3 times that of the Somme. They were also supported by 2,340 Livens projectors. These were used for gas attacks. Impressive gains were made initially, partially due to better British planning and partially because General Oberst Falkenhausen of the German 6th Army was conducting a partial positional defence as per the old doctrine and partially a flexible defence as per the new doctrine that was being introduced. Tanks supporting the offensive in Arras were virtually useless. A blizzard slowed their advance. By midday on the first day of the assault, the 9th of April, the assault was bogging down. However, two divisions had actually advanced 4 miles. This was more than any other division had advanced since the outbreak of trench warfare. These successes, along with the success at Vimy Ridge, indicated to Haig and Allenby that potentially their diversionary attack was going to become the decisive breakthrough. However, by the 11th, the attack had culminated. Eingriff troops, the counter-attack troops of the German army, had moved into the line, and the 6th Army now had a new chief of staff, Oberst Fritz von Losbert. He was the expert on flexible defence. The further the British advanced also meant that the further the British guns had to fire, or they needed to be moved closer to the new front line. Haig said to Allenby's chief of staff that the enemy had now been given time to put the Drocourt-Quéant line into a state of defence and to organise positions also in our immediate front. He has also brought up a large amount of guns. Our advance must therefore be more methodical than was permissible after the enemy had been surprised and had no reserves on the spot. Now we must try and substitute shells as far as possible for infantry. Allenby was keen to continue the attack. His divisional commanders, however, weren't. He overruled them, and they, quite uncharacteristically for the British Army, went to Haig, who overruled Allenby. In 5 days, the Third Army had sustained 80,000 casualties. The French went on to attack on the 16th of April. It was a complete disaster, and by the 30th of April, large numbers of French troops had mutinied. The US, however, had declared war on Germany on the 6th of April. The French, unwilling or unable to go on the offensive, would have to wait for US reinforcements to arrive, and this would leave the BEF as the main striking force on the Western Front. This sets the scene for the First Battle of Bullecourt, a secondary effort in a diversionary attack in support of the French Nivelle offensive. Gough, the British Fifth Army commander, would commit 2 divisions to the Bullecourt attack. Not from the same corps though, so he would have the 4th Australian Division from 1st ANZAC Corps, and he would have the 62nd 2nd West Riding Division from the British 5th Corps. Gough is an interesting character, and by interesting, I'm being diplomatic. He was educated at Eton. He entered the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1888 and was gazetted into the 16th Lancers as a second lieutenant in March 1889. He went on to serve in the Boer War. By 1911, he'd worked his way up to have the temporary rank of brigadier, and he was in command of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade. In September of 1914, he was promoted to Major General and given command of the 2nd Cavalry Division. He was, at that point, the youngest British divisional commander on the Western Front. April 1915 saw him promoted to General Officer commanding the 7th Infantry Division, so this is his first infantry command. And during the summer of 1915, he was promoted to Lieutenant General and became the commander of the 1st Corps. May 1916, he is promoted and is the commander of the Reserve Army, a formation specifically set up for the Battle of the Somme. On the 18th of July 1916, Haig ordered Gough, as the commander of the Reserve Army, to prepare for methodical operations against Pozieres with as little delay as possible to capture the summit of Thiepval Ridge. Haig allocated fresh divisions and also deployed the 1st ANZAC Corps, newly arrived to the Western Front opposite Pozieres. Gough attempted to commit the 1st Australian Division to an attack on Pozieres with just 24 hours' notice. The commanding officer, General Hookie Walker, was appalled by the scrappy and unsatisfactory orders from Reserve Army. And he later recorded in his diary that his concerns were being rushed into an ill-prepared operation. 1st Anzac Corps headquarters hadn't arrived on the Somme, so it fell to the divisional commander to argue with Gough about the impossibility of this attack. With sweat on his brow, he and his chief of staff, which was Brudden or White, argued until Gough gave in. Walker later wrote that this was the very worst exhibition of army commandship that occurred during the whole campaign, though God knows the Fifth Army was a tragedy throughout. The Reserve Army would go on to be renamed as the Fifth Army. He had a hands-on style of command, bypassing the corps level and specifying orders to divisional and even brigade level. One of his subordinates wrote, "Gough terrorises those under him to the extent that they are afraid to express their opinions for fear of being degommed." Heavy losses and complete failure, very typical General Gough, who apparently does not care a button about the lives of his men. Bean wrote a few interesting things about Gough. He did state, though, that really he did not know enough about Gough to be sure about the nature of his intellect, but he was sure that he had no grasp of the principles which were necessary for the control of great offensives. And he added that he was a cavalry officer and would have been an excellent, dashing patrol leader, but he made many gross mistakes with his army. His worst fault, we used to think, was his tendency to undertake partial and disjointed attacks on narrow sectors. His chief of staff cannot, I think, have been an officer of sufficient grasp, or he would probably have prevailed on his general to prevent some of these attacks. I wouldn't say, however, that his staff was extremely inefficient. I personally think that Gough was a very bad general, impulsive and thoughtless, and he probably made great difficulties for his staff. David Coombs, in his book, describes him as the combination of the best and worst of British cavalry commander. Energy, drive and ruthlessness, dismissive and rude to subordinates, charming when required with his superiors, inclined towards hasty, ill-prepared attacks without proper reconnaissance, frequently on a narrow front. John Coates, in his excellent book, describes Gough as a thruster who condemned the 1st Anzac Corps to another botched, failed enterprise in the First Battle of Bullecourt. In his book, Coates has got a very interesting quote about Gough. "We all fell into these mistakes, friend and foe alike, in the early days of the war. We were always looking for the gap and trying to make it, hoping that we would pour through it in a glorious, exciting rush and so put an end to any more heavy fighting. But war against a great, efficient and brave enemy is not so quickly ended as this. Under such conditions, war is a matter of hard blows, heavy loss, long, stern and desperate struggles, and victory will not be gained until the morale of one side or the other is broken." Coates goes on, "Unfortunately, at Bullecourt, Gough, by then in his 4th year of the war, was still looking for the gap." Birdwood, as the commander of the 1st Anzac Corps, was livid at the thought of going into the Fifth Army. Gough at this stage knew that following the attack at Arras, there was going to be a large battle at Ypres. He didn't know who was going to command that. Now, it could have been Allenby. Potentially, there was an opportunity for Gough to command that. So we've got Gough, who's got a supporting role to Allenby's attack, and how much of it is the fear in his mind that if Allenby's assault is successful without him doing anything spectacular, that he will be out of the running for command of the battle at Ypres. With this in mind, Gough sets about planning a quick attack on Bullecourt. Well, it's a quick corps attack. It was quick in the amount of time that was allocated to the appreciation of the problem, and it was very quick in the amount of time that was allowed for the marshalling of the resources that would be required for a successful infantry assault on the Hindenburg Line. Firstly, Gough was lacking in his terrain appreciation. He's done a big hands, small map appreciation, What wasn't factored into the assault was the fact that the troops would be assaulting up a re-entrant. Now, this is critical because it meant that they would be facing machine gun fire from three sides. From the front, from their left flank, and on their right flank from the machine guns that were emplaced in Quillan. David Coombs describes the issues that would be facing the Australian troops in the assault. On the 31st of March at 1st ANZAC headquarters, Birdwood and his staff acknowledged the difficulties the Australian infantry were likely to experience in the advance. Unlike Gough, they understood that breaching the Hindenburg Line would pose a far greater challenge to their troops than their advance against the outpost villages. Certainly White knew the difficulties. He wrote that between Quillan and Bullecourt, the enemy's lines form a re-entrance some 1,500 yards deep. He added that any thought of advancing here would be unwise unless Quillan were also attacked. These problems weren't insurmountable, and in fact, the doctrine at the time in 1917 had a method to be able to support the Australian infantry as they assaulted Bullecourt. The tactics had switched from huge barrages aimed at destroying enemy personnel, fortifications and morale, and moved to neutralisation, minimising the ability of the enemy to interfere with the infantry until they were almost on top of the trenches. To support the infantry as they advanced, a creeping barrage would be created. This denied German troops the ability to emerge from their bunkers and interdict the troops as they were advancing. The barrage would lift at certain intervals, adding between 50 and 100 yards. The issue with the creeping barrage is if the rate of the artillery advances was not the same as the infantry. The infantry could become bogged down, in which case the creep would get in front of them, and it was often very difficult to recall the barrage back to where the infantry were stranded. As far as the machine guns in Quillan, who would be able to bring down flanking fire on the advancing troops, Gough ordered a smokescreen to blind the town. Let's have a look at the artillery tasks that are going to be required to support the infantry as they're advancing, remembering that this is breaching the Hindenburg Line, a prepared defensive position, a heavily prepared defensive position. Firstly, the artillery will be required to clear a path for the infantry in the barbed wire in no man's land. Secondly, there's the neutralisation of the enemy troops in those trenches with a creeping barrage. Barrages will also be required on the flanks to ensure that there's minimal interference from the enemy on either side of the assault. The town of Quillan has a significant number of machine gun nests which will need to be blinded to deny them the ability to provide flanking fire for the German defenders. The infantry will need to be protected from German defensive fire. That will be done with counter-battery fire. And lastly, the artillery will be called upon to respond to German counterattacks, providing what was called back then SOS fires. The job of clearing the barbed wire in and of itself is a significant task. Many of the belts of barbed wire are very thick, so multiple breaches will need to be created all along the line. If they don't, if there's only one or two breaches, that's going to create a choke point, providing an easy target for enemy machine gunners. The more Birdwood and Brudnell-White looked at the problem, the less they liked it. There was no suitable forming up location for the troops prior to the advance. They would need to form up in a sunken road, which would leave them with up to 800 metres of open terrain to cover. That terrain was going to be covered in snow. This would mean that the troops would be highlighted against a white background as they were advancing, making very easy targets. Not only that, but Birdwood knew that he was up against the 27th Württemberg Division, part of Falkenhausen's 6th Army. This was recognised as being one of the best in the German army. The artillery preparation of the battlefield commenced on the 20th of March. This was a light bombardment with the 18-pounders, which was the lightest field artillery within the army. The rate of bombardment increased on the 31st of March, however, it was still insignificant for the task at hand. There are multiple reasons for this. Firstly, the roads leading to the 4th and 12th Brigade areas were quagmires. the trucks towing guns got stuck, and the tractors that were called in to recover the trucks also got stuck in the mud. Horse-drawn artillery had no chance of getting through. Gough had been told of the appreciation that there wasn't enough guns, wasn't enough ammunition, and they weren't going to be able to get them in place to be able to provide for the amount of time that was required to clear the barbed wire. Despite this, on the 24th of March, he told Haig that his army would be ready by the 8th of April. In order to support the Fifth Army, Haig considered allocating a few tanks for their assault. Gough asked for 4, he was allocated 8, and he ended up with 12 tanks. To make matters worse, Haig ordered that the roads not be churned up with guns and ammunition movements. This was an order that Gough actually countermanded, but it was only for one day. That was because he was aware of the parlous state of the artillery preparations. Ladies and gentlemen, we will conclude here for the moment. Next week, we will return with our next instalment in the lessons for the Battle of Bullecourt, particularly around the employment of artillery.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.